Hello everyone, welcome to our 2021 Health and Wellness Will Be Different webinar series. We are so glad you can be here with us today. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, from the UK, from India, Thailand, Singapore, China, Italy, and many more. Thank you so much. We are very excited to have our two special guest speakers from the UK who have a very rich experience and background in marketing and business development in food, beverage, and of course, consumer healthcare industry. Today, we will learn about China and the implications on health and wellness in 2021 for all of us. We will deep dive into the changes in consumer behavior in China, the mega advance in digitization, the global decoupling dilemma, competitive dynamic and intensity, private sector in harmony with state sector. And lastly, we will learn a really great tool to hopefully inspire you to develop new ideas and new strategy to win in this crisis. We would love to encourage you to think about these 4 questions while listening. What excites you? What concerns you? What would you like to know more about? And lastly, what ideas do you have for your brands and business? If you have any questions, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat box on your right-hand side. Our team will gather your questions to ask the speakers at the end of the sessions. And if we cannot answer your questions during the session, don't worry. Our speakers will answer all your questions and we will send the answers to you after the webinar. And now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our 2 special guest speakers and our moderator of the day. Vernon Bradley, a founder of Aeroline Marketing. Vernon is a business and marketing expert who has a lifetime experience in consumer packaged goods in both healthcare, food, and beverage industries, working for some of the world's most recognized brands in both mature and emerging markets, especially Southeast Asia and in China market. His love affair with dynamic evolution of China began in 1995, where he was responsible for initiating the consumer healthcare business platform in China with SmithKline Beecham as the regional director. Then again in 2004, where he helped the team at Ipsen with a transformation of their China business. With over 20 years experience of business development and marketing, he founded Aeroline Marketing together with Paul to help organizations develop business strategies, launching new brands and driving startups with their imports and exports businesses. Our second speaker is Paul McDonald, a founding member of Aeroline Marketing. With over 30 years in China and Southeast Asia, adding Chinese and Asian languages to his European range, Paul has witnessed momentous change in China. In fact, he managed to escape SARS in 2003 in China, and this time again with COVID-19 in mid-January. With over 20 years as a consultant experience, moving from beverages into food, daily, health, and personal care. He has worked with board MNCs such as GSK, Durex, Reckitt Benckiser, DKSH, and Unilever, as well as local family-owned. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. And lastly, let me introduce you to our moderator of the day, Steve Sowerby, the founder of Exponential and a co-founder of Consumer Healthcare Training Academy. With a strong passion for unleashing the potential of people, Steve founded a training and consulting agency to develop people and build brands across the world in multiple industries. With his strong passion and in-depth knowledge in people development, team building, brand management, business strategy, and positioning, he is one of the most sought after speakers, facilitators, and trainers in consumer healthcare industry. Over to you, Steve.
Well, thank you. We're going to open up the videos in a minute. I think the host has stopped us opening the videos. So if we can start those, that would be great. But in the meantime, let's just, Vernon and Paul, are you able to hear me? Okay, my video is now started, I think. Vernon and Paul, if you could turn on your videos, we'll get started.
Videos are on.
Hopefully the video is on, Steve.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Vernon. Great to see you. Anyway, very welcome to this second of the series about health and wellness in 2021. And I'm very, very excited because there's been so much news about China right from the beginning in January with the COVID-19 starting off in Wuhan. And AIM was absolutely serious when she said you escaped the coronavirus in Wuhan because you were there just before, I understand. Is that right?
No, that's correct. Both Paul and I were there. I was also there in Beijing during SARS, Steve.
Oh my goodness.
So really quite familiar with what goes on in China.
Yeah. Well, we want to take that experience because, as I said, there's been so much in the news. Of course, the COVID has given China the spotlight early on this year. Now we have political issues, we've got military issues, we've got technology issues. And underneath all of this is, of course, healthcare, which has been the real focus of the last 4 or 5 months from that region. So what I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure the participants are looking forward to, is getting under the skin of China, looking through all of these elements of news that have been going on and trying to understand what does this all mean for healthcare, not only for healthcare in China, but for healthcare for all of us around the world. What can we learn? What can we develop? And how can we start building our businesses to meet some of the expectations from our consumers following this crisis year in 2020? So I'm going to hand over to Vernon now to talk us through some of the insights around China so we can start to understand the implications for healthcare. So Vernon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I click on the screen here and hopefully be able to get control of the slides. AIM, if you could kindly bring up that first slide.
There we go.
Okay, if I can just start out, Steve, by just saying, look, it's an honor to be here and thank you very much for the invitation. It means a lot to both Paul and myself. I think really if I can just start by saying, what's the big story here? What is it that we have to tell? I mean, essentially, what we have witnessed in China over the last 25 years, as you said, I went there in 1995, is nothing short of a miracle in terms of an economic transformation. It's been absolutely epic. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely perfectly.
Very good, very good. Basically, I think both Paul and I have seen China just flourish. We've seen people blossom. We've seen people take on a whole new quality of life that they didn't have before. And it's been an enormous privilege to be part of that, Steve. In fact, actually, it'll be a major part of my book in the making. I won't have to plug that book at this moment in time, but obviously having been there for a long period of time, there's a lot of exciting tales to tell. I think the fact is today, though, if you look what's happening, China is leapfrogging the world. It's taking digital by storm. It's really grabbing it by the horns and going with digital like nobody else. And really, I want to get into that because actually that's one of the major drivers of change of China. If you look at the healthcare sector, it's fair to say that really healthcare has lagged behind things like fast-moving consumer goods in China. And there's good reasons for that. Basically, the infrastructure wasn't there weren't enough doctors. The government have always been concerned about prices, and prices we kept them low, but the low prices means the doctors don't get paid. So it's actually been very, very complicated affair for them. But back in 2015, the government changed all of that. they actually signaled that healthcare, the healthcare of the nation, was the most important thing. They placed it as a top priority, and they said that the most important thing was innovation in healthcare. I think at that point in time, people did not anticipate that the innovation would come through digital, and it has. People will say, well, how is it that China are going to develop new biopharma technology companies and things like that? That hasn't really happened. There has been a huge transformation as a result of digital, and that's what we're going to unfold here.
Perfect.
So how did all of this happen? If you could bear with me 1 second, I think the slides, yeah.
There we go.
How did all this really happen? Well, if we go back 30 years, China was really the factory of the world. It was a low-cost producer sending out exports and gathering dollars galore. In fact, I do remember at one point in time, somebody saying in about 1998, yeah, there were more dollars in China than there were in the rest of the world, and I'm sure that's true. Also, given the size of the population, manufacturers were desperate to get into China because they recognized actually that's where the future lied. So really, foreign direct investment was huge. And in fact, at one point in time, something like 60% of the world's foreign direct investment, again, kind of in the 90s, was in China. So China went from being the factory of the world to the market of the world. Because basically the government, when it had all this money, had to do something with it. It basically put it into the economy. It enabled people to buy housing. They provided mortgages. I do remember many good friends coming to me saying, should I buy a house? Well, many of those friends went off to buy 5 or 6 houses. Really quite incredible what happened, right? And today, if you look at the numbers, I mean, 23% of world consumption, right, is now in China. The burgeoning middle class is about 440 million people. They're forecasting, but by 2025, that'll be up to about 550 million people. So really, it's gone from being the factory of the world, whereas actually supplying everybody else, now being the market of the world, because actually the main engine of growth here is really that burgeoning middle class in China. Luxury goods are a major part of that. In fact, they're forecast to be about 40% of the world total by 2025. There's been a natural increase in desire for better health in the whole process. I mean, and that matched with obviously an advance in products and services has led to a more dynamic market. And that's just say growing over time. And it has lagged everything else, but now it's growing for the reasons I mentioned before and the reason that we will get into. But China comes out of COVID with mixed response. Like most countries around the world, government have put in their initiatives. We don't need to go into all of that. They're stimulating the economy. Quite predictably, people are going to be quite cautious on the one hand. And I think a good economic indicator there is actually the restaurant situation, eating out. Chinese love to eat out. There's no doubt about that. I mean, it's a major occupation. And essentially, though, you know, the hospitality sector is still operating at about half capacity. Table covers down from 3 to 1.5. So they have been cautious, but that is to be expected in a way. But really, what's surprising is this pent-up demand has fueled enormous shopping sprees, both online and offline. And just to pick up on a couple, Hermes store down in Guangzhou, on their first day of opening, took $2.7 million for their luxury goods. I mean, that really was well, unprecedented. It's a record. They're talking about revenge travel at the moment. Trip.com have actually tripled their bookings for travel. Now, it's still got travel restrictions in place and what have you, but actually the Chinese are anticipating going traveling. How is this? Basically, coming out of COVID, the Chinese are coming out cash rich, unlike the rest of the world where actually we've been hit very, very hard. And one of the reasons for that is the Chinese are probably the most resourceful people on the planet, right? Certainly in my experience in the 25 years I've been there. Their level of savings is up to 2 times greater than the West. So they can come out, they've got the money to spend and they're spending. However, there is an age cohort with a very different attitude and behavior to everybody else. And basically that's the 20 to 30-year-old, which is the engine of growth in China. This is the 220 million people born in the 90s. But one of the major differences with these people is they've come out of this era of the single child policy, where they've been under the roof of their parents, supported by their parents who became wealthy. These people have taken on a totally different perspective of life. They're borrowing money. They represent 33% of credit loans. They're not saving like their families have saved in the past. They've never experienced a downturn. But now, coming out of COVID, what you see is they're going from spendthrift to frugality because they've recognized the need for change. Prudence is emerging. In a recent survey by Sino.com, 42% of people said they will now save and plan before impulse buying. Interestingly enough, 80% of people are intent upon buying insurance. But actually, as far as the healthcare industry is concerned, and actually quite an interesting point, is almost 1 in 3, or you could say 1 in 4, is stating that healthcare insurance is now top of their list. They don't like what they've seen, obviously, from COVID. But even the wealthy are taking stock. The G2 generation, which is basically the 30 to 50-year-old, are the wealth holders. They're the people who made the money. They're my friends who bought 4 or 5 houses, etc. They're called the G2 generation. Interestingly enough, in Q1, as a result of these people, bank deposits were up 8% and loans down 22%. Wealth management comes to the top of the list now because family security is everything, right? It has made a very, very large impact upon people. I think one of the most interesting things too, health and beauty has always been right at the top of the list of Chinese people. They say to get in life, you need to look beautiful. And they spend a lot of money, obviously, in the beauty sector. But now for the first time, health and hygiene is taking precedence over beauty.
Yeah. Just on that, Vernon, how are you seeing that playing out? Are they somehow shifting towards more healthy regimes? Are they investing in more health schemes? Are they buying more health products? How do you see this actually coming to life?
Yes, we've seen a major shift in people buying basically online more than anything else, stocking up the pantry with medicines. As I said, they're also intent on buying insurance packages. So looking after themselves has become a major preoccupation.
Yeah.
I think offline they've suffered somewhat, but that's basically because the consumer has found it very, very easy to order things online. And you will see as a result, what I'm going to say shortly is that the digital thing has just enabled everything for them. It's made it so easy. Huh?
Yes. I remember the huge increase in prevention, vitamins, minerals, and supplements that exploded in Australia was actually fueled by this generation in China through internet and e-commerce.
Yeah, it's made it very, very, very convenient for everybody. I think if you go back to this whole thing about the technology and digitization, there's no doubt about it, the Chinese are far ahead in this area. Actually, if you look at the numbers now, 1 in 4 transactions, right, in retail sales are now on the internet. E-commerce accounts for 24% of retail sales. But if you look at Germany, 9%, USA, 11%. China has almost half of all global e-commerce transactions. And it's not just the young. The elderly have embraced it as well. You will see, right, elderly people who are very, very capable of using mobile telephones. In fact, it's not just using the phone, they're using the phone to pay for their transaction as well. Mobile payment transactions are 3 times greater than in the USA. So everybody has embraced this technology. Back in January, I couldn't resist putting this slide in, by the way, right? But this is a street hawker selling sausages in Chengdu. Paul and I just stopped to talk to her. You might notice that she's on the phone, and right in front of her is a card, right? And on that card is a QR code. That is how she is collecting her money. Cash no more. I mean, I would predict that by 2030, China is basically a cashless society. Everybody is moving across to digital and using Alipay, WePay, whatever it might be, to pay for their transactions. Paul and I were in Shanghai quite recently, let's say as COVID was breaking, and actually we found it difficult to get home in a taxi because the taxis wouldn't take cash, the restaurants wouldn't take cash. It is definitely heading toward the cashless society.
Wow.
You can't not talk about something like Alibaba and all of this. I mean, everybody has heard of Alibaba. It's vying for global position with Amazon for #1 online retailer. They have a GMV, that's a gross merchandising value, almost of $1 trillion now. During COVID, people were saying, oh, Alibaba is not doing so well. Well, the reality is their forecast has been adjusted from 35% to 27%. I think we'd all be delighted even if we had 27%. Right? And in fact, actually, if you analyze the whole situation, their losses have actually come from investment losses, not from actually the consumer buying less. So here's a company on track to deliver $71 billion in turnover in 2020. Absolutely incredible locomotive in China. A lot of people don't know it, but Taobao, which is part of Alibaba, and I won't go into much detail here, but during COVID, right, they have a 7-fold increase in live streaming. Live streaming has become actually a very strong means of promoting your products. Taobao is all about C2C, not B2C, but people are just live streaming all the time on the basis that they can sell their products. But just look at the size of this. Mobile users, under 30, 60%, a $15 billion business with a GMV of $850 million. Absolutely huge, right? An unstoppable locomotive. But if I can get into talking about digitalization in a bit more detail, this is transforming the health of the nation. Essentially, you've got a place that has just over 450,000 drugstores, 5,000 chains amongst those 450,000, representing about 50% of the drugstores. But it's how they're all operating that is all changing. And a lot of that has come down to landmark events marked by the government. As I said, they started the initiative in 2015. They continued that through in 2019 at the 13th National People's Congress, where they continued to support this initiative that they put into place called Healthy China 2030, where they said offline sales should be subject to the same standard, basically, online sales should be the same as offline. Right? They call it internet and health, Steve. They are obsessed now about getting electronic records for everybody in China. That's for the 1.4 billion people. They're obsessed with big data and management of the big data and how they can actually turn that to their advantage. One of the most important things, they've legitimized the categorization of drugs, whereby it's now legitimate to actually sell online, where before it was a bit of a gray area. But it's very clear now what you can do and what you can't do. And then some of the other things that they're supporting are very interesting too. They're supporting the application of their AI solutions and the popularization of consultation online. Given the shortage of doctors, here's the opportunity to actually promote consultation. Paul will talk more length about obviously how the private sector and the public sector come together.
Yeah. Vernon, just before you move from that previous slide on the government initiatives, how did the government manage to ensure that the products sold on e-commerce are not fake, have the right quality, are within the sort of the shelf life? Because, you know, it was always in China, one of the biggest frustrations of many consumers in China was, you know, what I'm buying, is it a fake or is it real? Hence the huge interest of Made in Australia, for example, which gave it you know, that legitimacy of this being a good quality product. How have the government tried to ensure that quality and reassurance is top of mind when companies are selling through the e-commerce channel in China?
You're absolutely right. Obviously, fake product and things like that has been a major concern, as has expired stock in the rural communities, which is really why they look to the internet now to overcome all of this. Is it a perfect place at this moment in time, Steve? No. But I think what you see is a continuous crackdown on fake product.
Yeah.
Pinduoduo, I'm going to talk about Pinduoduo in a moment.
Yeah.
They're more concerned about FMCG goods, but last year they suffered heavily. They suffered a lot of criticism for fake product. They're now intent upon selling more healthcare product.
Right.
So all eyes on them really to see how they're going to clean their act up. It's not perfect by any means, but you have to be registered with the government. The products have to be registered with the government. So they are tightening down on procedures that, and they didn't have those procedures before.
Yeah.
So it's getting better by the day.
Yeah. But this is something we need to really be looking at very carefully, because one of the challenges to many organizations to sell through e-commerce is the regulatory restrictions put on by the local FDAs that do not allow medicines to be sold through the internet, through e-commerce. So I think we've got a lot to learn in the way that China are ensuring the quality and also the reliability of the service to get the medicines to the right people. So a lot to learn from this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, interesting time, Steve. Alibaba Health, belonging to Alibaba, obviously. Essentially a one-stop shop. Look at the results here, obviously since they've been released. Q3 results 2019 versus 2018, they're basically doubling their business. And a lot of this in terms of healthcare is they're making good health achievable at the fingertips of people, which is actually what their line is. How have they done this? They're promoting now suppliers on Tmall through flagship stores. They've aligned themselves with 11,000 medical institutions and enabled Alipay insurance payments. In November 2019, they started their own concept of 30-minute delivery for stores in 10 cities and 1-hour emergency drug delivery in 120 cities. So they're driving into the supply chain here in a very, very, very big way. All right? All of a sudden, they've taken it over. And you'll see in some of the other companies I'm just going to talk about how each one is taking their own ground as much as they can. JD.com, they're reaching the masses in the tier 4 cities. That's where they believe they can make their mark. The great thing they're doing there is ensuring fresh stock delivery. As I said, expired stocks were always a problem, but they're focusing on fresh stock delivery. But the game changer here really is they act as a wholesaler. So that great big monster of a infrastructure you had in place before of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 wholesalers is disappearing as the likes of JD.com will come along and make it much more efficient. So there's a whole new wholesaling service. I thought it was quite interesting that they're developing the omni-channel approach. And again, this 30-minute service of drug delivery to your home or to wherever it might be. New users there accounted for 80% of sales during COVID. So it just shows you how the consumer has switched their behavior very, very, very quickly. Because they know how to work digital, COVID has brought along a different set of circumstances. I might as well now go and buy online. Interesting enough, they're setting up smart clinics. And this is great for the doctors because the doctor's income has been restricted over the years. And that's been held back because of obviously what people pay for pharmaceuticals. But now the doctors can earn a new income stream by actually consultation online. And all of this enabled via WePay. Also, JD.com spending a lot of time now on AI, artificial intelligence, where they're saying the accuracy of artificial intelligence in consultation is now 95%. Right?
Wow.
That really is quite impressive. Right? Just in summary here, a few other organizations, Yiyao, Zhongke, Ping An, and WeDoctor, all making their own mark. The point is there's a lot of competition between them, but they're trying to pursue a path that obviously gives them a point of differentiation. So Yi Yao, for example, is specializing in equipment supply to 170,000 pharmacies. Zhong Ke is specializing in physician education. And that's important because potentially that negates the need for your foot soldier representatives online, sorry, in the field. Ping An is pioneering consultation through AI. And interestingly enough, they had a 10-fold increase in the user base, right, during COVID with 1.2 billion visits, right? Just shows you how things are changing. And the most fascinating things is it's actually cost efficient. Ping An are saying that basically the cost of consultation is 2/3 of what a normal consultation would be.
Yeah, just on that, Vernon, what's the patient journey? So if I'm a Chinese patient and I'm looking to have a consultation and also buy my medicine, typically what happens? What do they go through? How do they arrive at having the medicine then delivered to them?
There's a number of different ways of doing it, Steve, because obviously they can go on to Tmall, they can order direct from the pharmacy if it's aligned O2O. I mean, it's a variety of different mechanisms, and it's all just digitally enabled.
Right. So I can see a doctor by going through jd.com or Ping An, and then get a prescription from them, and then that can then be filled by an e-pharmacy or equivalent, and then it gets delivered to my door.
All interconnected, and that's where the Chinese are winning, because actually they try and drive it forward as a seamless connection.
Right. Okay, so technology really then connects all of these different players to ensure that it all is a seamless experience. Very interesting.
Technology is enabling the whole thing, and this is the innovation that the Chinese have brought. So it's not through understanding biology and medicine itself, it's all in actually the supply chain, how to reach the masses. This is their innovation. I couldn't resist putting this slide in, Steve, right? Because it's like delivering pizza, okay? This is ding ding kuai yao, right? Kuai yao basically means quick need. It's literally ding ding, you know, here I am, medicine's in the back of my pannier, on the back of the bike. So simple, right? Here's another organization, 2-hour delivery, guaranteed. It's an organization that's getting massive investment from SoftBank and CICC, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody is at it.
Very good, very good. And I think that that 2-hour, 30 minutes up to 2-hour delivery is really important, because if I'm waking up with a cold or a flu and I don't want to go out and I want to get my cough cold medicines, I don't want to wait till next day to get it. I'll really need to. I really want to get it in 30 minutes at best. So hence, I think anyone thinking about e-pharmacy really needs to be thinking very, very strongly about that supply chain. How do we effectively get it to people, you know, just as we can learn a lot from the pizza delivery guys who can get the pizza to me in 30 minutes and it's still hot and fresh. Well, imagine my medicines being delivered in the same time. That's what I'm expecting.
Steve, we were talking about it in 2016, and here we are in 2020. It's actually happened.
It's happened. Yeah.
We were saying antidiarrheals, you want them immediately. Well, actually, you can now get them immediately.
Yeah, fantastic.
And actually, as a result of obviously these digital facilities. During COVID, I thought there was an interesting point made by Equal Ocean that they recognized the market's up by about 27% to $28 billion, right? Literally as a result of COVID, right? So a significant increase. Be wrong on me to not mention Pinduoduo, right, which is a ginormous organization now founded in 2015, as I said. Their GMV is $163 billion. What these guys do, they basically group people together for low-cost buying. And they're digging down now into the tier 4 cities. So they're selling value, 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 value. If you group together with your friends, you can buy products more cheaply. Now, they have not specialized in healthcare, but they have dabbled in it. And they're now saying they're going to up the game in healthcare. Yeah. I mean, this is just an example. You can see on the left-hand side, tier 4 cities represent 43% of their business. But back in September 2019, They sent out 10,000 blood pressure monitors and 10,000 blood sugar monitors and a lineup of OTC drugs for the masses. Yes, they were criticized for fake product and what have you, but I think this is an organization you're going to see clean its act up. It will follow the book because, quite frankly, I mean, at $163 billion in 5 years, right? It's just a phenomenal machine.
Astronomical numbers. Astronomical numbers. Wow.
It is astronomical. I think my last chart before I summarize, I couldn't help but put this one in, Steve, because actually it's all about marketing, really. Marketing has changed in a very, very big way. Like many markets around the world, now it's opened itself up to influencers and to vloggers. But here's a great example. One guy who's basically gone from rags to riches. He was a humble clerk in a store selling skincare. He's now doing his own thing online. He can sell 15,000 lipsticks in 5 minutes. He himself today is now worth about $5 million and counting. Right? But there is a word of caution here to any marketeers, because for every good story you hear, there's a bad story as well, right? Yeah. And you can lose a lot of money in here. And Paul and I spent some time in January talking to a number of people about all of this, and you can lose your shirt if you're not careful. Yeah. But somebody like this, yeah, skincare. Where are the implications here for skincare? Because actually, skincare is less regulated. This is a guy that could be selling skincare quite easily. Doesn't have to sell just lipsticks. He could sell a lot of skincare products. So it is about picking your partners very, very, very carefully. So in summary on my side, because I've probably taken too long, Steve, right? Innovation in disruption to supply services. That's what it's all about. But first and foremost, right? We have to understand generational change in attitude and behavior. If you don't grasp that concept, then you can fail in the future. But there's no doubt about it that the engine of growth is changing their ways. And actually, as a marketeer, you need to actually follow that trend or go along with it.
Yeah.
Digital is opening up new route to market efficiencies, as I've explained. They're going deeper reach, faster service, more efficient, less wastage. This is the innovation. AI consultation is coming along leaps and bounds, right? New doctor communication services negating the need for supplier sales forces on the ground. Wow. Do I need reps anymore? No, I probably don't. I can probably go to actually one of the organizations and actually have them take over my full training services of the doctors. So last but not least, actually, as you look at your own organization, it is all about now looking for new advanced capabilities in digital, right? They are essential. It's no longer the traditional sales and marketing people that you need. You need a hybrid of people, and actually it's how you put those teams together.
Yeah. Very good.
I do apologize for probably taking far longer than I should have taken.
Not at all. It's been really fascinating, and I know we've got some more questions for you, perhaps when we get to the question time, Vernon. But really important that we understand this, and especially the role of digital. But of course, there's other elements as well. So I think we're going to hand over to Paul now, who is going to talk to us about some of the other major shifts that have been going on to help us understand the more holistic picture of China. And again, what does it mean for our healthcare going forward into 2021?
Sorry.
There we go. Hi, Paul.
Yeah. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon and good evening. Off you go.
Just trying to get Vernon to turn his echo chamber off.
Fantastic. We can hear you perfectly.
Fine. Like Vernon, thanks very much for inviting us, Steve, to take part in this. And thanks for the very fulsome introduction. It's actually difficult to claim to be an expert on China. I wouldn't do so because it's such a vast array of facts, figures, geographies, languages, and it's changing by the minute. Even this morning, there was extra material for my talk. The ex-mayor of Chongqing has declared that China is suffering from an economic war, which has been waged by America, which we'll come on to in a minute. Even at this minute, bringing new facts and figures about how they feel victimized, if you like, by the Americans. We'll come on to that. So the vogue word at the moment is decoupling. It was originally a very obscure financial term, but it's now been brought in to cover this huge battle which is going between Make America Great Trump, but not only Trump, and we'll see that later, and an increasingly what is called an assertive China. And as a result of this, the old comfortable pattern of the workshop of the world that we heard about before is breaking up as China moves up the value chain and starts to compete against companies in the West. So effectively, this is precipitating a whole deglobalizing of world trade. But the Chinese look at it quite differently, and I know we've got friends of ours in the Chinese audience listening. Chinese, the China phrase, or the China characters you see beneath, means central kingdom. For Chinese, they're reasserting their natural place in the world as the center of the world, as the major economy in the world, which they were in the past. And now after 3 centuries, which in Chinese terms is mid-term, they're finally reunified and rebuilding themselves as the world's major power. Underneath you see some pictures, the last empress or the Empress Dowager, Mao. The last picture is of Xi Jinping, who models himself more or less on Mao. In the middle you see Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was the guy I once compared, and I think I got into a bit of trouble in America, as being greater than Buddha or Jesus Christ, because he brought 600 million people out of poverty. And this year is supposed to be the year where there are no longer any people in poverty in China, according to their criteria. In fact, Hangzhou recently said they have 1 poor person. So it's very, very extreme. Of course, it's by Chinese standards, but this contrasts with what you see in India, where the latest figure is, I think, 50 million children, third of the population of malnutrition children are in India. So China does not have that problem, which it did, obviously, 40 or 50 years ago.
Yes.
So China was the leading power, actually. People used to think it was overtaken by Britain, but overall it wasn't until 1890 when the US overtook Germany and then overtook China. But in 2013, China caught back on a PPP level, purchasing power parity, but now they're targeting to overtake the USA in nominal GDP. Possibly, it was originally Stan Charts said by late 2020, possibly by 2030. Either way, we are seeing that overtaking of the US, based obviously on the 1.4 billion population, because the per capitas are still much lower, which I'll come on to in a minute. So this decoupling of the 2 economies is really accelerating. We've heard all about the trade war that Trump has been talking about a lot. It's been building up with boycotts, people like Huawei, the containment strategy as it's seen by China in places like the South China Sea, where China is expanding and the US is sending over its fleet in order to contain China. And generally speaking, there's obviously a lot of economic and political fallout from COVID. China is going to use this COVID crisis very much to speed their overtaking of America. They are responding, of course, to some of the aggressive moves from the US. They're trying to hold on as long as they can to the global supply chain, but more for the future, they're seeking many more diversified international markets. I frequently visit East Africa, and in fact, I use my Chinese a lot in East Africa. I'm always coming across Chinese in the most obscure places, building railways, building bridges. I've rescued a few at customs where they've gone into trouble and they don't speak English. So everywhere you go, and of course they say, well, the black man is saying to me, why are you speaking yellow man language? You know, when I last intervened. So it's a very, very clear sign of globalization from the Chinese side. And there are no Americans there. There are no American influence. There's not even much Japanese. It's all Chinese. So China is looking for these diversified international markets, but at the same time, it's bringing up its own domestic market. Vernon told you about all the consumers, and they are shifting from this old export-led model to beefing up their internal market. And they're very bullish about it. So they're saying, okay, we know that the US is after us. They're going to try and decouple, but the quicker this happens, the more we will react. And we're not frightened of it. And we know that this will continue. Even if it's Joe Biden that comes in, a lot of those policies will still remain. It's not just the craziness of Trump, but it is actually two elephants in the room struggling for supremacy. I'll quote a little bit from Dr. Doom, is an American Iranian economic commentator who predicted the 2008 crash. He came up with a phrase that US is retreating, it's missing in action and is moving away from its soft power that it used to have. And he's saying that MAGA has actually become Make China Great Again, because everything that Trump is doing in many ways is helping China. So they're abandoning a soft power. They pulled out of things like the Trans-Pacific. We've seen it with WHO. The leadership role that they took during the 2008 financial crisis or during Ebola, they've moved away. They scorn their allies, whether it be Japan or Korea. They try to squeeze money out of them. There are no economic programs of investment. They are trying to boycott China technology, like Huawei. They're saying, if you take Huawei, you're off our secrets sharing list. We will boycott other goods for you. So they're forcing Europe to go into the US camp. It's leaving it very difficult for countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, countries like Thailand, which have traditionally been quite pro-American, you know, back from the days of Vietnam.
Yes.
But economically, they benefit so much from the connection to China and the trade pressure which is coming from the goods and exchange with China.
Yeah. Just on that, Paul, I've heard a few commentators now talking about a resurgence of Asian pride. I think COVID, many Asian countries have managed the COVID crisis in a very good way. I mean, here in Thailand, we have very low numbers of infections, and unfortunately, there have been fatalities, but very few. In Vietnam, which is a really outstanding examples of just over 300 infections and 0 deaths. And people look across to Europe and see some of the things going on in Europe. And of course, we know, unfortunately, the issues in Italy, Spain, the UK, now the US, and saying, well, actually, maybe we're not as far behind as we thought here in Asia. So do you see this as really starting to pull Asia and the West further apart?
In many ways, yes, I concur that there is this Asian pride. I mean, you didn't mention South Korea or Taiwan. They were also
yes,
leading.
Indeed.
Our Prime Minister is always using the word world beating. We are indeed world beating in terms of our death rate and in terms of our lack of uptake of efficient working digital systems. Our track tests and tests is now possibly going to be effective by September. You know, by when you compare it, and I'll show you briefly later on, the Chinese systems. Yeah, there is a sense of pride. Certainly China has that great sense of pride. I've been having all sorts of funny notes from my former Chinese teacher who's going on at me, blaming me for the British colonies and what have you.
Oh my goodness.
I personally have not done very well on COVID, whereas China has. And I've said, well, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. It's not me personally. So there is that sense of pride. And yes, I've spoken to a number of people who say in Thailand and that, and it's very, very clear that they see the European, for once, caught with the exception possibly of Germany or Portugal, caught very much with their trousers down. So in the same way, there was that loss of face when Britain lost Singapore to Japan in 1941, 42. You see that the emperor has no clothes, and it's more the case for the US, which is obviously much more in people's mind, that people say, "What chaos? What chaos?"
Yes.
And going back to this point about China's dominance, I was just going through. China is the leading trade partner of every single country in APEC.
Yeah.
South Asia, in all the South Asian countries, a lot of the Middle East, most of East Africa, not Nigeria, Russia and Brazil. So large areas of the globe are having China as their major trading partner, both import and export. So China was first into COVID, but they're the fastest out. We've already got some figures, at least on the service side, which are indicating the quick recovery. The government has become quite flexible. They're actually now re-allowing hawkers and street vendors in Beijing, which 2-3 years ago had been totally cleared away, as a quick way of mopping up unemployment. And actually on a social level, you know, a lot of the small eateries you used to find in Beijing about 15-20 years ago were gone, and you had to walk, you know, several blocks before you got anything to eat. Now you can just walk, you know, outside your house and there's someone doing some noodles or some breads or whatever. The other area where China has moved ahead is they offer financial support via this massive Belt and Road project, which is going particularly to Asia, Southeast Asia, less to India, obviously, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, to the Middle East, and as I mentioned before, Africa. They've built all the railways and infrastructure. They've done more in 5 years than the British ever did in 50 years, and with much more modern technology. They do have a few tank traps of their own on the way, however. Belt and Road has brought some countries into debt. Sri Lanka springs to mind, where they had to give away the dockyards that the Chinese built because the economic equation didn't work. They couldn't pay the belt. There is the disputes in the South China and the East China Sea, which I will mention in a minute. Chinese diplomats are very heavy-handed at the moment. We heard in the old days that Chris Patten, the old governor, was a prostitute, the 1,000-year criminal, the tango dancer. Now I think it's Australia is the gum on China's shoe. So there's a sort of rather picturesque and somewhat insulting language, which isn't very diplomatic. And it's an expression of frustration where they sense that the West looks down upon them. Their only way to get back is by these insults. And there is an insensitivity to racism. Recently, McDonald's banned black people from entering in Guangzhou, partly because a couple of them had COVID. And then they said anyone black has COVID, so they can't come in.
No, that's awful.
Major problem.
Very bad.
Partners.
Very bad.
Yeah. The Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to revive the Silk Road. The old Silk Road, which I picture here, was obviously lots of camels moving back and forth with silk and manufactured goods. Now it's being recreated. Xi Jinping launched it in 2013. It is obviously, the motive is to grow its soft and hard power. Its focus initially tends to be the things that China is very good at, building infrastructure, railways, highways, iron and steel business, but it's massive in its scope. So it's covering something like 40% of global GDP, nearly 70 countries, and 2/3 of the world's population. Obviously, not every country is involved to the same degree, but it is a massive project. And you can see that the newer map is much more extensive than the old map, and it goes all the way down to East Africa, all the way even by train through Germany and to the United Kingdom. And partly what they're trying to do is, you know, get all the resources from Africa, because Africa is going to be one of the growing continents after Asia. As I said, the Wolf Warriors, there was a popular film where you had this Chinese character who is very aggressive and always wins, of course. And that's what's a model now for some of the ambassadors. The trade war started off with the Huawei boycott from the States. They came back with a product, agricultural products targeted at the areas that Trump supporters live in, you know, soya, pork, cotton. And the whole COVID is turning into a blame game, the whole WHO being dragged into it, Australia. And as a result, because Australia supported Trump, they're now being punished. They suddenly levied 80% on barley and possibly 20% on all other goods, which will affect, we're doing some projects on dairy. You mentioned vitamins. This could easily affect the vitamin industry, particularly as Chinese vitamins are wanting, obviously, to take away the role from foreign products. Quickly, the South China, because you have to at least have a look. China has this huge map of South China, which it basically wants to take over, you know, even going up to within, I think, 12 nautical miles of the Philippine coast. It's an area where a third of global maritime trade passes through. And in that endeavor of building up islands into small fortresses or air bases, with their navy, they've upset 5 Asian nations plus Taiwan. So it's one of the downsides of China that they, you know, while they're trying to grow economically in Southeast Asia, they're also creating quite a lot of bad feeling in that area. If I move away from the macroeconomics and come a little bit more into the market and the dynamics, we've always talked about China as being the export market, but in fact, it's gone down quite dramatically. It's averaged only 14%. It peaked at 36% in the early part 2006, but actually it's now looking much more like a continental economy like the US. So if you look at Europe, you know, Germany, Korea, sorry, UK, France, and Korea in Asia, they're very much export-led, much more in terms of their economies than China or the USA. And the post-COVID and the trade wars will lead to greater emphasis on this domestic market. So within that, they've come up with a plan, and it's obviously a threat to high-value products. They want to move up the chain, and they want to increase Chinese content to 40% by this year and 70% by 2025. Of course, they won't necessarily achieve these, but they are goals and are supported. And it's going into pharmaceuticals to a degree, more on the supply chain, as we'll see in a minute, semiconductors, IT, AI, of course. What they've been doing in terms of facial recognition has left the US behind. Obviously, there are lots of security issues which make it more difficult for Western countries like Germany, which has a very high protection of privacy, so they can't necessarily copy what the Chinese are doing, because the Chinese population will accept basically whatever is imposed upon them. So increasingly, domestic manufacturers will tend to replace foreign manufacturers, and I'm sure that will be happening in areas like the easy parts of pharma, like vitamins. So they have a plan to combat the loss of export markets. A lot of it will go into improving sales of automobiles, up in the quality, consumption within urban areas. A lot of it will be in real estate, but they'll also be putting in things like care services for the elderly, because they've got an aging population. So again, this will come very much into the healthcare arena, possibly into hospital supplies, the technology behind managing old people. Rural consumption they want, because it's still 40% of the total population, 560 million people. A lot of that will be through expanding the online shopping, the Pinduoduo, for example, that we saw from Vernon. New consumption in terms of smart home appliances, and generally speaking, improving consumption by rebuilding car parks in shopping centers, making all shopping experience much more attractive. And this is a typical thing where they will, at the time of COVID, the quickest way of stimulating the economy is by infrastructure development. So a lot of that will be targeted, however, at citizens. Now, the dynamics within the market, and this chart from McKinsey is basically showing that although there are a lot of consumers and a lot of consumption, it's still a much lower GDP and a much lower urban disposable income. So it's only 8,000. So less than a quarter of the US and just over a third of Japan's 3 times bigger. So what's happening is that the products which really go are mid to low market products. And more of the growth is actually coming, as again, as Vernon mentioned, in the 3rd and 4th tier cities, which are growing much, much faster than, say, Shanghai and Beijing. So what it means to access the market, you must have affordable products. So typical local products, if one looks obviously at the telecoms, Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo are very much mid-market. They're as good as, if not better in some senses. The camera's often better than Samsung and Apple, but they may be 20, 30, 40% cheaper. Lenovo, 40% market share, but they tend to be much lower price products. Domestic cars, lots of them, very cheap. Of course, they don't last very long. The emissions are not great. In the pharma area, you know, the total pharma market is still generally generic. So 80% of the products sold are generic. And Chinese manufacturers, and this is where they haven't invested, 97% is generic. So their value products are only 3%. But they control 55% of the global API market, which we all saw because some of those factories were based in Wuhan and were shut. And that was the reason why paracetamol sales and aspirin sales and cold and cough became under pressure, because so much of the APIs were coming out of China and out of Wuhan, where the production was suspended. And if you look at other products, I did some projects actually with Dettol. There are local products like Walsh, and the company, which no one had ever heard of, was actually outselling Dettol within China. Because it was selling mainly in the third tier, fourth tier city. At that point, Reckitt was just measuring Guangzhou, Beijing, and Shanghai.
Tier 1, tier 2,
But they were leaders in the other 150 cities. So what? You know, they could afford to leave those ones out.
It was very interesting, Paul. In a recent webinar from Nicholas Hall, to actually see that 8 out of the top 10 fastest global consumer healthcare branded companies were Chinese in terms of growth. They're still down in there in terms of total size ranking, but certainly the momentum is building that many Chinese companies are moving from generics into branded and will become global forces, absolutely. And at the moment, many of them are only selling in China.
That's right. That's right. Or if they're not in China, they'll be selling into markets that you won't notice, like Ethiopia, like Kenya, like Nigeria, Bangladesh, and they will gain huge market share because they can sell affordable products. If you look at refrigeration, you know, the cheap fridges that the Americans and the Koreans moved away from, they're all coming from China. You know,
and also the technologies will be more available to those markets as well. The healthcare technologies that Vernon was talking about earlier on in this talk will soon be perhaps taken up by many of these what we call developing markets that will then accelerate their healthcare, you know, in a much faster way than some of our economies in the West.
That's true, because the way that the Chinese will do it is they will go in with a total package, including financing, whereas a Western, you won't get necessarily aid from the German government or from the US government. It'll be a manufacturer going in on his own or possibly in conjunction with a local NGO. Whereas the Chinese will come with a total package, and they will go at the government level and they'll go at the lower level, and they'll put roads in as well if that's needed, you know, to get to clinics. So they're way ahead of it in that. And there are so many big markets, you know, Tanzania, where, you know, it's 50 million at the moment, but within 30 years is going to be 120 million. So countries which are being neglected by the West, but are huge dynamos of growth. So just moving on a bit more rapidly because we're running out of time. The export models is being moved on to this domestic, and it's going to be difficult for foreign companies to keep up with this, because during the COVID, there was such an uptake, as Vernon showed you, of internet selling and all the technology that supports that. The Chinese companies are very quickly adapted to that, whereas Western companies haven't even got that far, and the governments haven't got that far. So we can see healthcare generally as a sector, and these charts are a bit misleading because one is in billions, one is in trillions. So you can see that it's a 30-fold growth in absolute terms, but more significantly, it's gone from 3.5% to 6.4%. If you think of the UK, which lags, we're at about just under 10%. France and Germany and Holland are around 11%. So it's still half of that level in terms of the overall investment. But what they want to do is by bringing in cheaper methods, and obviously they're more into generics, so they get more bang for their buck, even though the proportion of spend of the GDP is lower. And part of this ambition, and I show here the old universal healthcare that they had under Mao Zedong, which was the barefoot doctor. Here you see acupuncture being administered in the village. This was obviously abolished under Deng Xiaoping. It sort of fell by the wayside. But the Healthy China 2030, which Vernon mentioned earlier, is a path to universal healthcare, but using a much more of a digital platform. So they will have a database which covers everything from cradle to grave for the whole 1.4 billion population. That is the ambition. There's no other area. If you think of the US, where they struggle to have 60 million people that don't even get healthcare, the Chinese are trying to extend it to 1.4 billion. And so a lot of that will be involved with things, the delivery of drugs, with the supply chain, rather than necessarily major pharmaceutical innovation.
Yes.
And so Western governments haven't got there. You know, I mentioned the track and trace, and I say track, trace and lose within the UK system. They've confessed that a third of the people they're tracking, they're not even getting any addresses from. So it's very, very inefficient. Whereas the Chinese are not looking at competing with us on high value products, but in terms of a fully integrated supply chain within diagnostics and a universal coverage at possibly a third of the cost of Western medicine. An illustration of that is the fact that they've got this traffic light app, which has been introduced to most of urban China, where you basically have to report and show your healthiness by being COVID-free, in which case you get a green light. You then have that on your smartphone and you go into a shopping center or a railway station or an airport. If you scan the QR code, it will read that you have a green light and you can go in. If you haven't got a green light, you don't get in. If it shows as yellow, you're then sent home for home confinement. If it's red, you're immediately whisked away and into a quarantine so-called hotel. It's more like a dormitory, which you have to pay for until you've proven that you're COVID-free. So it really is Big Brother in a very practical way. And this has all been introduced within a period of 3 months.
Yes.
Based on technology, which is obviously there, but they've pulled all the technology together, which the West has not managed to do. So, if I look at the interplay between private and state, private does play a big role, particularly in innovation. And there's this figure where it pays half of the tax, it does a lot of the output, a lot of the job support, but in essence, the party still controls everything. And this has increased. So Xi Jinping does not believe in letting free markets run too out of control, because that will threaten the one-party rule. So Xi Jinping has strengthened the party's role in government and in media. He says that Chinese state TV and all media are there to serve the party. There's lots of subsidies for at national and local level. They've sometimes kept zombie companies that should have gone bankrupt alive. If you look at private companies, they are much smaller. So the top 25 Chinese companies, only one of them is supposedly private, and that's Huawei, which of course people say is not private because people in it used to be part of the state. But Huawei is the biggest private company. And if you look at those private companies, actually, none of them are in healthcare. It's mainly real estate. It's all hard, old-fashioned infrastructure stuff. So healthcare doesn't figure there. So healthcare, we'll come on to in a minute. So even when you have private companies, they are still in a symbiotic relationship with the state. So the major strategic areas will always be covered by the state-owned enterprises. Government will still issue targets for development. Private sectors are allowed to innovate. They're seen as a tool of innovation. And some of those innovations will inevitably fail. But that doesn't matter. The excesses of private can then be realigned or even scrapped. For example, the bicycle loan scheme, which started off fantastically successful, there was a 100 renminbi deposit. Then the government thought, well, this is not fair that these companies are just milking people of 100 renminbi. So they cut the deposit and then the whole thing collapsed, leaving, as you say, this bicycle scrapyard. So it was something that boomed and bust within 2 years. Absolutely amazing. So whenever private innovation gets too big for its boots, if you like, they will be reined in. You know, even with Alipay and WePay, they threatened the banks, so they were then brought much more under state supervision. Looking again in companies, so Shanghai Pharma is only 18 in the world ranking, so about the same size as AstraZeneca in the top 25. Sinopharm would be by size second only to J&J, but it's more of a mammoth, if you like, of distribution and all sorts of things thrown in. Sinopharm is mainly a state-owned enterprise. It has some private money in it. All the others are listed on the stock markets in China, but they are effectively quite strongly controlled by the government. But generally speaking, if you compare Chinese pharma market with US or EU, it's still very fragmented. So the top 10 only cover 20%, whereas the equivalent in the West would probably be closer to 50%. So in summary, and I'm sorry, this has been a bit of a rush because we're both
no, it's very good.
The whole point is that the government wants to create this universal healthcare, which is very different in the way the NHS was structured, but in a sense, the goal is the same. And of course, extremely different from the US idea. But the key thing for them, the difficulty is covering this 40% rural of 560 million people across this huge geography, which takes you 5 hours from if you go from the far southeast across to the northwest, it's 5 hours by plane. It's a huge geography, the same as London to Baghdad. So theoretically, there would be an opportunity for Western companies to benefit from some of these digital systems. But the problem is, if you look at the decoupling and the Huawei issue, basically, Trump has said, hands off. You cannot work with the Chinese on these systems because they were developed in Xinjiang, or they're developed to suppress the population of Hong Kong. So it's a with us or against us, which we first heard under George Bush, but Trump is very much in it. So what it's going to do, it's going to mean that the Western companies are going to be in the slow lane of a highway where the Chinese are going to be steaming on ahead. Sorry to mix my metaphors. So it's going to be very difficult for them to challenge those developments. So it is more of a threat at the moment than an opportunity, I'm afraid to say.
Right.
Anyway, that wraps up my short presentation. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. I think this, I think what China are doing in terms of extending healthcare across the whole of the population is really important, because I always have felt that healthcare should be not just a privilege of the few, but actually available to everyone. So there are things that we can certainly learn from that. And one of those, for me, is the technologies. So just before we go on to the last point, I just wanted to, before we have some more questions, I just wanted to just touch also on what we've just heard, because what's really important for us is that we take this information and we look at what we can do with it in our organizations, in our markets. So we've got some great insights here, and we're going to have a couple of questions right at the end. But for me, we've got to start thinking in this blue ocean mindset. which is we've really got to think outside the box, not focusing on our competition or markets that in the way that we've defined them, not focusing also on what is the regulatory constraint today, because we can see with what's happening in China that especially after COVID, many of the FDAs will be starting to look very, very critically on how they can allow some of the medicines to be accessed, especially through e-commerce, and also always looking at the consumer. So, Blue Ocean Strategy, if you haven't read the book, please get a copy, because this is a really fascinating book. And really, we've been going through with COVID some of these changes. This crisis of COVID has made us look at so many things in a different way. So I would encourage you to look across, set yourself a business challenge, look at different elements, just as we've done today. Don't just look at the market of healthcare, but look across the whole of the economy, look at different drivers, look at how consumers are thinking and moving. And then create opportunities going forward. And there's a nice little tool which we'll send to you called the Fresh Eyes model, where you can really look at some of these insights coming out of talks like today and trying to understand how this can help us to create new opportunities, because that's what COVID is really driving us towards, really new opportunities, because we've really changed in many ways the way we think. Now, let's open it up for questions. I've asked some questions, but Aim, I think there's a couple of questions for Paul and for Vernon that we can talk about. So Aim, can you open up for questions? What have we had in the question box and in the chat box?
So the first question is, can you tell us more about the crossover of traditional medicine and the huge growth of interest from the 80s and 90s generations?
Yeah. Vernon, I think that was a question for you. Traditional Chinese medicine seems to have a lot more interest with this growth driver group that you were talking about, those born in the 80s and 90s. What sort of experience have you had in terms of that traditional versus modern approach to healthcare in that generation?
Hopefully you can hear me there, Steve.
Absolutely, Vernon. Perfect.
Traditional Chinese medicine is still a very, very big thing in China. There's no doubt about it. You've still got specialist outlets which just focus solely on traditional Chinese medicine.
Yes.
Does it show significant advance? No. That's probably because actually it's all wrapped up with the past anyway. I don't think you're seeing as much inroads there on the digital side as you do on pharmaceuticals as such.
Yes.
But it's there to stay and in a big way.
Okay. Yeah, very good point. Just from our experience here in Thailand, we've seen traditional Thai medicines actually having a resurgence. And part of that was because of good manufacturing practice had been absolutely now a regulatory change in the production of many traditional medicines. So people are now getting standardized products with standardized benefits. We've seen this also in other Asian markets. So very important. Traditional medicine is not going to go away, but what's really important is that, first of all, the quality is there, but secondly, that there is science behind it. So doing studies behind these traditional areas has really driven up the attraction to many of these modern consumers. Okay, there was another couple of questions, but let's take one, Aim.
Yeah. So another question is why good health and well-being is part of the WHO developmental goals. So are climate action, peace and justice, and no poverty. At the same time, in the West, consumers are moving in brand companies that behave ethically. If this new consumer mindset has not reached China yet, do you think it will? And what effect will it have?
Okay, maybe who would like to pick that one up? Paul?
I'll have a go. Can you
Okay.
turn off?
Yes.
I think inevitably there will be a difference in China, because anything which goes into threatening, if you like, or impinging upon government policy is not necessarily available for open comment. You have seen some interventions, for example, the wild food market, and this goes actually also into traditional Chinese medicine, is now going to be more regulated. That's to say,
Yes.
you're no longer able to buy it for food. Supposedly, you'll be able to probably still get it on the black market, but they will still allow it for Chinese medicine. But there's going to be increasing regulation. So that is also partly self-preservation, but it's also giving into the sensitivities from the West of people saying, well, look, you know, you guys are eating bats and all this sort of false news which came out connected with Wuhan. So there is a sensitivity. But I don't think you will get at this stage the same degrees of so-called ethical, because this will be seen by the Chinese as imposing Western values upon China. And in the same way as in Thailand, I think you'll also have kickback against the imposition of Western values over Thai values.
Yes.
So, yes, there will be some recognition of it, but it will not be a major motivator in the next 5 years, I would anticipate, in the way that it is in the West.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, we're coming towards the end. So I've got, I'm going to put you both on the spot to say, after all of your experience in China, and of course, you have connections with many companies in the rest of the world, what would you say would be your advice to companies involved in healthcare for their plans in 2021? If you were going to give one really strong direction to healthcare companies as they develop their strategies for 2021, given what we've learned today, what would you say? So Vernon, let me ask you first.
Having come back quite recently, Steve, so I came back in 2018. The change, as we've said, is absolutely phenomenal. I would look at the structure of my company, and I would realign the capabilities completely, right? Because I think what you need to do is be looking at new capabilities in digital and partnering with the likes of Alibaba Health or JD Health or whoever it is. Because without a shadow of a doubt, if you ain't on that train, right, you ain't going anywhere.
Right. Very, very good advice. Thank you. And Paul, what about you? What would be your one piece of advice to organizations going forward into 2021?
Well, I'm afraid a bit of an echo in both sense. Yes, you've got to be much more digital. Having grown up in the Coke system at one point and put in lots of very traditional routes to market, that's no longer the emphasis. It's going to be much more the digital. I think the key thing is that you've got to be incredibly sensitive to what's going on in China, because it's developing so quickly. You know, you go away from China, even for 3 months, you go back, there's something new. So you have to be totally conscious of these changes. The other thing is, this is a repetition of what I always used to say, and it hasn't changed. China is not one market. It's not even 4 markets. People sometimes used to ask, what's your China strategy? I said, well, you haven't got one. You know, what you do in Shanghai is very different from what you do in Guangzhou. It's different from Chengdu, even different from Hangzhou, which is only 1 hour by bullet train. So China is immensely diverse, much more diverse than the United States, even though it's a continent in itself. It's probably as diverse as maybe India, or even parts of the difference between Southern Europe and Northern Europe. So there are incredible differences. And so your team has to be very, very alive to all these differences in consumption patterns and weather patterns. You know, because the way you eat food, from, you know, the rice of the south to the dry noodles in the north, because it's from pork in the south to lamb in the west. It's very, very different. And if you haven't got that fine tuning, you'll end up with a strategy which might work in one city, but you're missing out on the other 1.35 million.
Yes, indeed.
Million, sorry.
Indeed. Fantastic. Thank you both. I think
Steve,
there was...
if I could just say one more thing, though.
Of course, Vernon.
Hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you. Perfect.
You can, yeah. I mean, just building upon what Paul said, yes, it is about the alignment of capabilities, because interestingly enough, Paul and I must have covered something like, what, on our last visit, 25 pharmacy drugstores right across Shanghai on our last trip, right? And we went from city to city to city. And we were actually quite surprised by how very little was happening in store, okay? So, you know, whilst all of this is happening digitally, right? At the same time, there's opportunity to service the pharmacist, right? Because nobody seems to be doing it. So, you know, it's as Paul says, China's not one place. You've got to recognize all the dynamics. You've got to come out with sensible strategies and plans that basically address all the different trade channels now and the dynamics within them.
Yes.
I could go out and sell a lot more product, even through the 450,000 drugstores, just by servicing them properly, but they seem to be neglected.
Very important point.
Having a channel strategy, very much channel driven, partnering with each, very, very, very important.
Yeah, very, very good. So very good and practical advice. Even though we have this digitalization, don't forget the traditional routes to market that we have. And we need to keep servicing those because those are still important. Very good. Well, thank you both very much. And thank you also for all of you who have joined us from around the world. I hope that you'll get a chance to join us at our next webinar, which is on the 17th of July. And that actually picks up on one of these very important points that both Vernon and Paul connected with and referred to, which is the important element about collaboration. How do we create a seamless route to market? How do we accelerate innovation? How do we change faster? And there we're going to have Trevor Gore, the founder of Maestro Consulting, who has spent many years with Reckitt Benckiser as one of the lead connections with the pharmacy through training and conferences with the pharmacy associations, who is going to talk to us about change and collaboration. And the moderator on that occasion will be my colleague, Dave McCaughon, who will guide and ensure that we have questions and comments that will help us all to get value out of the hour and a half that we'll be together. So with that, we're going to close the webinar. I want to thank you all for joining us. Please keep in touch. We will be looking to repeat the webinars every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on the calendars. And every single one will give us some insights about the way that we can start to build our brands and develop our people so that we can ensure that we can give best of health and wellness outcomes to our communities. Because ultimately, that's why we're part of this industry. So thank you very much. And with that, we're going to close this webinar. So thank you very much for joining us and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Vernon. Thank you, Paul.